Hello, BookTube, and welcome back to BookTrek 2023, the Summer of Trek. This is a BookTube event. It's now in its third year. It's created by Vin at Revenant Reads. He's assembled a group of great booktubers, just like he did last year and the year before that, to talk about Star Trek fiction, all summer long. Now, I've been overindulging myself in June. I've been doing a Star Trek video every day. I don't know that I'll be able to keep that up all summer long. I could easily do it for interest. I love Star Trek stuff. But we shall see. More to the point, today's video is all about history. And if you think that the history that I'm going to talk to you about is the history of the Federation, well, yes, we'll get to that. But first I want to tell you another kind of history, another story from the mists of time. I want you to think back, to imagine a time when your grandparents were meeting each other for the first time. They'd both been married once before, and those marriages hadn't worked out. Now they're not in the first blush of youth, but they're still young. And they meet. And they fall in love. Your grandparents do. And they decide to start a family. And your grandfather goes off to war, your grandmother stays at home, maybe she makes tentative footsteps into the workplace. And the family, your grandfather comes back, hale and healthy, at least physically, and the family starts. Their second attempt at a family starts. And your parents are born. Little babies. They spend a day or two at the hospital, and then they come home. Little babies. Bright, pink, wrinkled faces, can't open their eyes, can't grasp their hands, can't do anything. Tiny little babies. Your parents. Tiny little babies. Right around that time, right around exactly that moment, was the first few times that I had book reviews printed in newspapers. Okay? And then your parents are getting a little bit bigger. Hair starts to sprout. They start to eat a little bit. Not solid foods yet. They're still in little cups of little stew and whatnot. And they eventually, after an enormous amount of time, they start to crawl around on the ground. Your parents do. So your grandparents are getting a little older. Then your parents go to grade school, and you start to wear the grade school clothing, and the times are a-changing, and your grandparents are starting to think about retirement, and your parents are in school. And they go to grade school. For years, they go to grade school. And the whole time that they're doing that, I am on the fainting couch with a baseball team of beagles, reading. I'm reading roughly 120 pages an hour for an average of 8 hours every day. I'm not only reading because I'm also walking and caring for all of those dogs, and I'm also submitting book reviews or being an editor for some book section. But I'm reading for an average of 8 hours every single one of those days. The first day that your parents went to grade school, the second day, the third day, and so on and so forth. Every one of those days, I am reading. Even when I'm traveling, I'm reading. An average of 8 hours a day, which means that 50% of the time I'm reading much more than that. 120 pages an hour for an average of 8 hours every one of those days. While your parents are going to grade school. And then they go to high school. And they fumble around with bras and dating and puberty and whatnot. And then they go to college, and maybe they ship off to war. A different war, maybe the same war. And they have all sorts of experiences. Your parents do. And they meet their first loves, and they have a marriage, and it doesn't work out any more than your grandparents' marriage did. So years have to go by for them to figure it out, and then eventually they figure out that it's not going to work. There's a long, protracted divorce. This is after grade school. This is after high school. This is after college. They have a long, protracted divorce. It feels like the divorce is lasting forever. And every single one of those days, I am on the fainting couch reading 120 pages an hour for 8 hours on an average every day. And then they do divorce, and more years pass. Every single day, I am reading. More years pass. They find their second love, the love of their life. They start a new family. That's where you come in. That's where you're born. You're born from that second marriage, and you crawl around as a baby, Day by day, you cut your teeth. It feels like it's taking forever. Every one of those days where it feels like it's taking forever, I am reading on the fainting couch. My beagles are getting old. They're growing gray and blind in the eye. Some of them are dying. New puppies are coming in. The roster is changing, but the activity is the same. An average of 8 hours a day, 120 pages an hour. By this point, I have long been involved in the publishing world. I am getting books in the mail every single day. I have had the Brattle Bookshop at my elbow the whole time with an endless supply of cheap used books. Every day. While you are going to grade school. And then you go to high school. And again, it's day by day by day. Is there a bully who's picking on you? It'll feel like an eternity until you can resolve that problem. I'm reading through that eternity. Then you go maybe to business. You go into the business world. You go out into the world. And you work at your company until you retire. Decades. We're talking decades. Where you work at your company until you retire. And every single one of those days, every one of them, I am reading on the fainting couch. An average of 8 hours, average of 120 pages an hour. Every one of those days where you're punching a clock. Hey, Sal, how's it going? Yeah. And then it's starting to get closer. Retirement is starting to get closer. Your midsection is a little bit bigger. Your hair is a little bit thinner. Your grandparents have long since died. Your parents are getting old. They've long since retired. You're getting close to retirement. You're measuring the days. And every single day that you're measuring is a day in which I am reading 8 hours on average, 120 pages an hour. And then you finally retire. And you've got a little too much time on your hands. And you go to BookTube. And once you get past the eventual initiation ritual of being bombarded with British booktubers who are 30 and who are screaming their heads off about books written for children, once you get through the initial initiation period of thinking that maybe that's all there is, you start to find this corner of BookTube. Variety. Real people simply unaffectedly talking to you about what they read, the kinds of books they like, that sort of thing. And you really enjoy it. You start to develop your favorites, as you will, right? So-and-so's verbal tics just drive me crazy. I'm interested in the books he talks about, but I can't stand listening to him. So-and-so's attitude just rubs me the wrong way, even though I know he means no harm. So-and-so is a perfect match. I love the way he talks about books, even though they're not the kinds of books I think I'm interested in. I'll definitely subscribe to his channel and watch. This is in your retirement. This is after you have worked all that time at your company. After being a college student, after being a high school student, after being a baby, and after your parents went through all of that too. This is you, in retirement, finding BookTube, and eventually you find my channel. I'm a prolific booktuber. I've made more BookTube videos than anyone. I've made more YouTube videos than any single creator. You find eventually my videos, and what's the first thing you do? You take your chubby little arteriosclerosed fingers, you plant them on the keyboard, and you type out a question that starts with, have you read? You start off a question with, have you read? There's this French author. He's called Stendhal. He wrote a book called The Scarlet and the Black. I bet you haven't read that one. Have you read The Scarlet and the Black? An average of 120 pages an hour. For an average of 8 hours every one of those days, all the way to retirement, all the way to your parents' retirement, all that time, nothing else. No corporate career, no sports career, no performing arts career, no pole dancing, no nothing. Just that, all the way through there, on top of a Jesuit education. And the minute you find me on BookTube, you type out, have you ever read? I mean, you seem like you've read Homer, but what about, there was a Greek poet called Hesiod. I have encountered this many, many times. I've, of course, encountered this long before there was an internet. My colleagues at the bookstore where I used to work used to jump at people who started off a question that way like they were leaping on a live grenade. My Deb used to do that all the time to new hires. She used to say, oh, no, don't start off by asking him, have you read? Phrase it some other way. Just bring it up. Just don't do that. You're going to get a tirade that's going to last for, what are we up to now? 9 minutes. Other people have done that. Long before there was an internet, I had to deal with this. And I kind of thought maybe I'd be done with it with BookTube. That was naive, of course. Have you read is eternal. And it does sometimes happen. And it is an affront. to the gods. It sends a thick and rancid odor to the high altar of heaven. It is unthinkable. And it still happens regularly. It's not as bad as a comment that I got on a recent Steve stream, where a troll said that the reason I don't like Cormac McCarthy's novels is because his novels are highly elusive of the Bible, and that the reason that I don't get that is because I don't know the Bible. That was a whole different order of magnitude, but that was a troll intending to troll. The people who ask, have you read, are not intending to troll. But it does still sometimes happen. And so I wanted to give a preface in this video to let you know the time scale of what we're talking about. To let you know why I bridle at a have you read question. It's not that I've been a casual dabbler in reading while I've been engaged in go-kart racing for all that time, while your grandparents were in their second marriages, while your parents were crawling around as little babies on the rug, while you were crawling around as a little baby on the rug. It's not like that whole time I was doing something else. I wasn't skeet shooting that whole time. I was reading that whole time. Obviously, I was reading. There's a written record of the fact that I've been reading that whole time. It is an unacceptable question. I don't like to rant, of course. Nevertheless, it gets me goat. So how much worse must it be if it happens in a BookTube event? Are there words? How sharper than a serpent's tooth? Those of you who are new to BookTube, you might be unfamiliar with the mechanics of how a BookTube event works. Somebody will think up an event. It's usually Michael K. Vaughan, but occasionally other people will think up an event. And then what they do is they decide, do I want to host this all by myself? For whatever reason. Olive, at a Book Olive, has one of the greatest BookTube events, Nonfiction November. She hosts it by herself. Everybody else is free to join in. They're enthusiastically welcome to join in, but there aren't co-hosts for Nonfiction November. Or do I want co-hosts to spread the love, to put the tripod of legs of this thing in other channels? If you decide that you want a team of co-hosts just for the fun of it, usually what you do is you set up a Voxer group. There's an app called Voxer. It's kind of a walkie-talkie app. You can leave messages, you can hear messages, but it's not a phone call. You get to the messages when you get to them. You leave whatever response you want. And you can invite multiple people to be in a Voxer group. And typically in a BookTube event, that's what you will do. You will set up a Voxer group so that the co-hosts can compare notes ahead of time. So they can coordinate when they're going to make an announcement video, or what is and what isn't kosher, what is and what isn't, out of bounds, that sort of thing. And, of course, for BookTrek 2023, the summer of Trek, Vin did that. He made a new Voxer group for BookTrek. All the co-hosts could join in and talk about BookTrek, this happy, fun event on BookTrek. And I naively assumed that the one place I wouldn't get, since that Voxer discussion group is made up of booktubers who've been around and seen my channel, I naively thought that that would be the one place that I would not encounter a have you read question, and I got one just the other day. Behind the scenes, in the BookTrek Voxer group, I got a have you read question. And we're not talking, have you read this obscure work of German imaginatism or Austrian futurism? We're talking about Star Trek fiction, for God's sake. I got a have you read question about Star Trek fiction. So that's the historical background that I wanted to give you for this particular video. There is other history. Getting a have you read question in a private Voxer group is just about the most momentous thing that has ever happened in human history. But in imaginary history, there's another momentous event. that momentous event is the Dominion War. That's, believe it or not, the best I'm going to do at a segue in this video. In Star Trek Deep Space Nine, a plotline developed that allowed the creators of the show, the showrunners and writers, to indulge in a fan fantasy that had existed for 50 years. The basis of Deep Space Nine, Star Trek Deep Space Nine, is that there is a Federation outpost, or used to be a Cardassian outpost, called Deep Space Nine, that is in orbit over a planet Bajor, which is in orbit of a stable wormhole, a tunnel through space-time to another quadrant of the galaxy. So, a pretty hot spot for trade. obviously, because you've got ships coming and going through a stable shortcut that would otherwise take them 10, 20 years to travel at maximum warp without the wormhole. That's the basis of Deep Space Nine. That was how the show kicked off. And right away, when the show premiered, I and a few other Star Trek fans that I knew really well, one of whom is tangentially connected to the book that I promise I will eventually get to in this video, immediately thought, well, okay, you've got an Alien of the Month, an Alien of the Week type storyline going on here, but what would happen if a civilization in the Delta Quadrant or the Gamma Quadrant wanted to attack through the wormhole? I mean, it's right there. It works in two directions. It isn't just us going to them. What if they came to us? What if warships came through that? In this far outpost with this relatively undefended planet, what would happen? The Federation would go to war with whatever came through there. The Deep Space Nine would be their first line of defense. It would be the first thing attacked, which would be an act of war. We thought about that, but never in my wildest dreams when Deep Space Nine was first airing, its first couple of seasons, did I imagine that it would eventually blossom into the culmination of a fan dream. 50 years ago, when Star Trek was new, there was a fanzine. Once upon a time, though, that was our fan fiction. That wasn't the only Star Trek fiction that we had, aside from the things that James Blish was writing. We had the only original Trek that we had was fanzines. And there was a fanzine that came out of, I think, Louisville. Louisville, I think, had this, or maybe it was Pittsburgh, that had an ongoing serialized story about some massive event that causes the dream of all original series watchers. What would it take for the Federation, the Klingons, and the Romulans to team up? Instead of being inveterate enemies to each other in three directions. What would happen? What would be necessary for them to team up? There were elements of that I read that fan fiction dotingly. We passed it around. Samizdat style. We'd always be asking people, is there a new installment? One of the drawbacks of that fan fiction at the time, 50 years ago, is that it was inconceivable at the time that the Klingons could be anything but bad guys. It took Star Trek The Next Generation to give us Klingons that were not just cookie-cutter bad guys. Once that happened, it became all the more likely. When you've got nuanced the Romulans were nuanced in the original show. We can appreciate the Vulcans, our distant brothers. The Romulans were shown as being noble. And even in the original show, we have Commander Kang, who is noble in his own way. He's a bloodthirsty Klingon, but he is noble in his own way. The seeds were there. Once The Next Generation happened, all you needed was the plotline, and it turns out in Deep Space Nine, the showrunners eventually gave us a plotline, because a massive civilization at the other end of the wormhole does have designs on conquering the Alpha Quadrant, the Dominion, which seems at first unbeatable. They are ruled by immortal shapeshifters who can look like anyone, the ultimate infiltration device. They are administered by cloned Vorta, who have really poor eyesight, really good hearing, but no ability. They don't have the ability to defy their masters. They are the perfect Nazi quislings. They'll conduct any atrocity. They consider the shapeshifters in charge of the Dominion, the founders, to be gods. They'll do anything for the gods. And not only that, but there's also cloned warriors, the Jem'Hadar, who are individually, physically almost unbeatable, and who are cloned in gigantic vats. They're gigantic batches by the Dominion. They don't have to recruit. They have a limitless supply of these things. And great technology. Fantastic weaponry. So at first they seem unbeatable. When they start to make formal demands, when things inch closer and closer to outright war, it looks like the Federation fighting alone will have no chance. Now, fans of Deep Space Nine will know that Deep Space Nine quickly becomes the story of the Dominion War, and does a fantastic job at it. And we know, fans of that storyline will know that the Federation doesn't end up fighting alone. The Klingons, of course, are allies of the Federation and will fight alongside them in some great, great moments. There are great moments scattered throughout Deep Space Nine of the Klingons fighting the Jem'Hadar warships. There's one moment in particular that I particularly love, with starring Jadzia Dax and General Martok. Jadzia Dax, of course, in a previous incarnation of her Trill identity, had been Curzon Dax, who was an old friend and very honored by the Klingon people, and she retains a lot of that sympathy. And General Martok rescues her at one point from some marauding Jem'Hadar, and she says to him through their intercom link, she says, "Who says there's never a Klingon around when you want one?" And he just gives the most lascivious chortle. Like, yeah, they know exactly where each other stands. He says, "Leave the Jem'Hadar to me," and goes off after them because great Jem'Hadar warship technology or not, the Klingons are still the greatest warriors in the Alpha Quadrant. But it's not just that; it's also the Romulans, right? In an absolutely great episode, one of the greatest Star Trek episodes of them all, "The Devil in the Deep Blue Sea," where Benjamin Sisko, the commander of Deep Space Nine, has to bring the Romulans into the war. Anyone's ever seen that episode knows, I watched that when it first aired, and I thought, oh my god, this is the best Deep Space Nine episode. It's a fake. What a fantastic episode. So eventually we do get the idea of the Klingons, the Romulans, and the Federation all working together to fight a common enemy. And that is the Dominion War. And it has massive losses, whole planets put to the sword, massive shifts back and forth in the storyline. We only get a bit of it. There's only so much Deep Space Nine can do. We only get a bit of it. And we don't get anything else. By that point, Star Trek The Next Generation was off the air, and of course Star Trek Voyager, well, they don't even know about the Dominion War. They have no idea until many seasons in. They're on the other side of the galaxy. They don't start to get word about something called the Dominion for a long, long time, many seasons, until a great episode where the Voyager's holographic doctor meets a holographic doctor from the Alpha Quadrant. And they have to sort of run the ship. Some very, very good stuff in that episode. Guest starring Andy Dick. So we don't know what the Enterprise, the flagship of the Federation, was doing during the Dominion War. Only barely little hints here and there. It's one of the great stories in Star Trek that is canon, but the whole of the story has not been told. And there were novels. There was a 4-part novel sequence called The Dominion War, and then a volume edited by Keith DeCandido about tales from the Dominion War. Now, just talking about Star Trek has put me in a better frame of mind, so I'm not going to keep ranting about the have you read question that I got, but it involved these books. Let's just put it that way. It involved tales from the Dominion War. And, of course, that was burned like acid in my eyes when I saw that. But I thought, okay, leaving that book aside, the besmirched book, the befouled book, there's still those 4 Dominion War books, 2 of which are written by one of my favorite Star Trek authors, Diane Carey, but it had been a long time since I read the first one. So I went back and read the Dominion War Book 1, written by John Vornholt. And there you have the Enterprise, the Sovereign class Enterprise, Jean-Luc Picard's new warship Enterprise. And there you have some Jem'Hadar ships there with a ringed planet and whatnot. A very stereotypical, cheesy science fiction cover. But at least it doesn't have people's faces on it. It shows you that this is going to be a story about the war. And it is, I could have, well, we'll get to that. I could have stood this to be something different, but it is still very good. I am learning to appreciate John Vornholt a lot more. I once upon a time thought he was a boring hit-or-miss Star Trek author. Now I'm starting to look on him as someone whose misses are rare. And this is not a miss. This is a high-paced, fast-paced storyline. I felt irritated with it partly because it's largely a digression from the Dominion War. A large chunk of this is Captain Jean-Luc Picard on an isolated mission with Ro Laren in search of a MacGuffin. In the fight against, there's a secret plot to create an artificial wormhole. An artificial wormhole to help the Dominion. Leaving aside, it's only Vornholt only gestures in the direction of whether or not the wormhole over Bajor is artificial. The Bajorans certainly think so. They think it's the product of living beings. And Benjamin Sisko has met living beings who live inside that wormhole. So maybe it's not a natural phenomenon at all. But in any case, at the time that this book takes place, that wormhole, the actual wormhole over Bajor, has been mined by the Federation, so that the Dominion can't bring in reserves. They can't bring in new soldiers, new ships, or anything like that. And they want another route. They want a solution to that. And the obvious solution is to create another wormhole. So there's that MacGuffin of a storyline. And I shouldn't dismiss it that way, because Vornholt does a really good job with it. I mentioned before in BookTrek, even so far along the way, we still have 2 months to go of this, but I mentioned before that Ro Laren and Jean-Luc Picard have a complicated history. That complicated history comes to a consummation and an end in the third season of Star Trek Picard. It's done really, really well. But you have to figure that between when Ro-Laren was a Starfleet officer who defected to the Maquis, a terrorist group that are fighting the Cardassians in the demilitarized zone. So the Maquis are all over the place as to what they should do about the Dominion. Especially once the Cardassians join the war against the Dominion. Well, where does that leave the Maquis? The enemy of my enemy is my friend. The enemy of my enemy is hurting my enemy, whether they're my friend or not. It becomes a very pleasingly complex political battlefield. And it's great that we get Ro-Laren back involved in that, because she is one of Star Trek's most complex guest characters. Something I failed to see when I was watching The Next Generation for the first time. It took BookTrek to really open my eyes to The Next Generation. And Ro-Laren is a terrific character. And now that I've seen her swan song, now that I've seen the way that actress brings that character to a close in Star Trek Picard, reading about her, what I have to consider her early adventures, is all the more interesting. Although I have to confess, the parts of this book that I liked the most were the gestures at the bigger tapestry of the Dominion War just itself. There's not enough of that in this book. There's not enough of that in any of these books, any four of them. And that has never happened. To the best of my knowledge, Pocket Books has never authorized a history of the Dominion War. A book that is a history of the Dominion War. Do it whole hog. I would say Star Trek fans will buy it. I would say do it whole hog. Don't have a MacGuffin adventure story. Just present it as a 23rd, 24th century history text. Invent a historian, invent all sorts of sources, include all sorts of interviews with all of the primary people that you can come up with, and just write it that way. Write it as an artificial future history. I would love to write such a thing, and I'd love to read such a thing. And as far as I know, that doesn't exist outside of fan fiction. That's a shame. Because this is over with, right? This is a Paramount doesn't have to worry about affecting continuity here. This is a story that's over with. This is 30 years ago, so you could write such a book. You could write a book called this is called The Dominion War. You could call it something else. You could give it a nice, a bridge too far name or something like that. Invent a historian to do it. Even if you're not, once upon a time I thought the perfect person to do that, the perfect narrator for that would be Jake Sisko, Benjamin Sisko's son, who is a writer. But maybe not. Maybe have another historian, a historian of the Dominion War. And maybe Jake Sisko is interviewed. Jake Sisko, I could imagine, would have written a book about his experiences with the Dominion War, something like, My Helmet for a Pillow or something, a more memoirish type thing, and that the actual history would be written by someone else. I'm assuming that the 23rd, 24th century is no different than now in that people would have known while this was happening that it was epic history. And right in the aftermath of the Dominion War, the Romulans, the Klingons, the Cardassians, the Federation, they're all on friendly enough terms so that you could actually talk to all of the participants. I would love to read that book. The Dominion War Book 1 is not that book. Certainly it's not anywhere close as an adventure story with the Dominion War as a backdrop. But none of the Dominion War books are. And so I enjoyed this a lot more than I remembered. But the whole time I was committing that ultimate sin of a book reviewer of wishing that this were a different book. And the book that I want it to be, I've never seen. Tales from the Dominion War, which will not provoke another rant, is not that. It's closer to that than these are, because the Dominion War is its focus, but it's still little, tiny vignettes. And what I want is Bruce Catton. I want a Bruce Catton-style history of this imaginary war. That would be fantastic. But anyway, I read this mainly to assuage the sting of encountering a have-you-read question in the last place on Earth I expected it. The last place in the Alpha Quadrant that I expected it. And now that I've done that, I will peacefully withdraw, and we will move on to another BookTrek book tomorrow, when hopefully I will be in a calmer frame of mind. Thank you, Booktube.